Jordan Manalastas, is that right? Who's a public defender representing New Yorkers in immigration detention who are facing deportation. He's also here representing UAW Local 2325. And we also have Leo from Workers Movement for Liberation and Plaza Proletaria. Workers Movement for Liberation is a youth communist organization working to construct a working class party, as well as he's also the chair of the Central Committee for Plaza Proletaria, a fraternal working class mass organization. He's born to Mixtec immigrants from the Mexican state of Puebla, and is from Sunset Park, New York. By way of introducing this, I'll introduce myself a little bit as well. My name is Cyrus Campo, and I'm currently teaching radical political economy at John Jay College. So that's personally where I intersect most with the immigrant community in New York City, as most CUNY schools have a high amount of students of that background. So I'm excited, and I hope you all are too, to hear more about what's going on right now in the city, in that space. So to get us started and talk about the state of the current organizing environment for immigrants in New York City, I wanted to enter this by way of sort of the narratives we might hear from the political and media class of the city. Mayor Adams, other local politicians who have blamed austerity and cuts to public service on the recent influx of migrants and asylum seekers who they claim are draining public resources. So just to give us some context, I wanted to start with, in your opinion and from your perspectives, how does immigrant labor fit into the political economy of the city, and what changes have immigrant labor seen to their organizing conditions over the last 5 years, and maybe what you foresee the changes to come?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first since I was given the mic first. Immigrant labor has always been necessary in this country for a long time. It goes through periods of criminalization and demonization in moments when they want to scapegoat a group of people. For us with Plaza, it really arose during and after COVID, because a lot of this immigrant population was not eligible the immigrant population that we worked with wasn't eligible for the stimulus, wasn't eligible for unemployment. So a lot of these folks really got pushed into the informal economy, and they started to street vend. We see a rise of it, not just in Sunset Park, we see it all throughout the city. A big portion is, or a big important part is Myrtle Wyckoff these days. But when we started, it was kind of really just the fact that a lot of this immigrant population was pushed into the informal economy, and we wanted to see how we can organize them in that economy. Because it was COVID and unemployment was gradually going down after COVID, but still the immigrant population was still largely unemployed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that's correct. I think that
Is that one not working? Is that?
Nope.
Yeah.
It had no battery.
Yeah. Okay. We can pass this one around.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello? Oh, there you go. All right. Yeah, I think that's correct that the immigrant population is certainly scapegoated, and I think incorrectly. You mentioned something about how the city and the budget of the city, and people are blaming immigrants for maybe draining the resources, and this is a bigger and bigger issue nowadays in the media, political rhetoric, not just here in New York City, but as well around the country. As you mentioned, a lot of these immigrants are not actually eligible for some of the benefits that they're claimed to be draining. And so there's not just a lot of misinformation out there, but disinformation about immigrants, and they're blamed for sapping resources, then also contributing to crime and all sorts of things. But as you mentioned at the very beginning, the bottom line is that without the immigrant population, there would be no workforce. I forgot the exact figures. It's been a while since I looked at them, but a significant proportion of the New York City labor force are immigrants of all sorts. Right? The immigration population is a very diverse population, not just culturally, but also in terms of their legal status. So some of them are U.S. citizens, right? You're an immigrant, you came from another country, you're now a citizen, you're still an immigrant. Likewise, if you have a permanent residency card, you're still an immigrant. There's a whole wide spectrum of immigration statuses that one might have. So they're not all monolithic. Some of them are in the informal, workforce. because they don't have work authorization. Some of them do have work authorization. Some of them don't even need work authorization because they're already authorized because of their status. But either way, no matter how you slice it, they are, a very, very significant and underappreciated part of the local and the national labor force.
Yeah, whether it's the informal or the formal economy, I mean, I think anyone who can, is trying to pay attention to what's going on in the city, like the scale of immigrant labor, especially in the service industry, it seems to be at a high or a high tide. Whether it's that or sort of like you were talking about, informal street vendors or illegal manufactories. I remember that article about the bootleg tobacco and marijuana for that. It seems to be like so foundational to so many different parts of the city's economy. Now that said, I'm curious from your guys' perspective as well, how immigrant labor and community organizations fit into this larger ecosystem of, I guess, other nonprofits and activist orgs that are focused on immigrant rights or workers' rights in those spaces, and how what the relationship is like between those organizations, as well as the relationship between these immigrant communities and law enforcement in the city.
I think maybe you're more suited for the first part of the question.
So I think important to mention in this conversation is the rise of fascism, and with that, like the rise of American nationalism, which has always been there, but it's being stroked a lot within the American working class, and it puts them in opposition to the new immigrant workforce. I say new immigrant workforce because, we were having a conversation before with another comrade about how even migrants that have been here for decades now kind of start to regurgitate these demagogic talking points that Mayor Adams, that Trump gives, because they are putting them against this new wave of immigrants, largely from South America, largely from Central America. It's the way the media paints it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that for us, it's really about uniting the working class in general around these demands that are anti-fascist, anti-capitalist, in essence. The thing with us and how we kind of differentiate ourselves from the NGOs is that the NGOs do blunt contradictions often.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, it's important to make these contradictions clear to them. Let them know, like, yes, we can struggle for reform, we can struggle for a lot of these things that you want right now, but the reality is that if we don't change this economic base, this capitalist system, all of these things are just piecemeal, and we need to kind of join into a larger fight around political liberties, honestly, and democratic rights, and making sure that we fight for those no matter who's in government.
So if I can just ask a quick follow-up to that, do you see the future of an organization like yours or ones that you're connected to as being, working with NGOs as a critical part of the future, even if it's something you might have to kind of grit your teeth and bear while you're doing it, or are you kind of trying to build more of a sense of independence from those organizations, or do you think that's the general trend among immigrant organizing spaces?
I think those both can be correct at the same time, in the sense of like us building power independently, but understanding that in certain points of our struggle, we are going to have to work with some certain NGOs that have specialties in certain areas. An example that from our experience is that like we had to work with Street Vendor Project, which is a big NGO. They do a lot of work around street vending. We needed to work with them. They had a lot of expertise and knowledge that it would have taken us a couple of years to gain, and they already had that. So we had to tap into that and kind of bring them close and see what they can teach us in that regard, how we can struggle legally. Because our thing is like we do need to exhaust all methods of resistance, basically, both legal and illegal. So I do think that, yes, we have to build independent power ourselves, but we also at certain moments in the struggle, we do have to work with these NGOs. Generally speaking, we think that the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist front is a wide front. And we're gonna find people from all different types of ideological backgrounds, liberal included. So we're not like repulsed by it. We understand the necessity of it, but we also understand the necessity of engaging in these struggles with them as an independent force. So
Yeah.
we can't get co-opted, because that is a big, always in the back of our mind.
As a negotiating partner
Yes.
rather than someone who's
Exactly.
sublimated into their larger project.
Right.
Okay. Very cool. If you want to answer the question of law enforcement, Toby.
Yeah, sure. But building off what you said,
Oh, yeah, sure.
I'd like to say that I'm glad that you mentioned that these NGOs are both maybe part of a shared front, a shared struggle, but also they can blunt the contradictions. That's very true. I say as somebody who's basically an NGO worker myself. And you know, my role and the kind of role that people like me play, I represent immigrants, or people, I should say, who are accused of being immigrants, because whether or not they are in fact non-citizens is something that needs to be proved in court. But so I represent people, non-citizens or alleged non-citizens, who are facing deportation, who are in the immigration detention system. I continue to represent them even when they get released, if they do get released, but they continue to face the prospect of deportation. So this is very important work, but at the same time, I am part of that legal system, that enables and facilitates deportations and ruining communities and so forth. So the work that I do, while important, is very limited in what I can do. The political horizon, well, there is no political horizon. The horizon is whatever the ruling class and the ruling government wants it to be. And there are certain narrow spaces in which I know people like me can navigate and maybe do some sort of damage control, or so not to denigrate my own work, but it is damage control. But damage control can mean something like the difference between life and death for an individual or for a family. So it's about narrowness. It's also about never losing sight of the bigger picture. And I'm glad that different non-mainstream or non-establishment institutions exist out there that can fill in the gaps. I should say not fill in the gaps, rather we are filling in the gaps in a bigger, larger gap that's being handled by more politically minded organizations.
Yeah, not to mention, I feel like, especially with an issue like immigration, any immigrant that's deported is a, measurable loss on power of labor and immigrant labor here in the city. It's one fewer person to help defend their interests. So it's a real staunching the bleeding, I can imagine. Now, how would you say, how aggressively is, and what's the balance between federal law enforcement and the city and their relationship to immigrant communities? Is it a pretty aggressive prosecution of deportation, or is there sort of an understanding among those people that this is a necessary part of the building of New York City's economy, and that they play a really important role? How would you characterize that relationship?
Well, the relationship between law enforcement generally, whether you're speaking about state or city or federal law enforcement with migrants, with immigrant populations, is antagonistic first and foremost. And that's true historically as well as today. Now, that said, it's not a monolith. So different institutions, different players in the legal regime, I should say legal regimes, plural, have different interests, different priorities, and different prerogatives that each one is attempting to handle. Now, when it comes to, say, the federal government, yes, if they find someone they want to deport, they're going to go after that person. When the state comes, when the state gets involved, or when the city gets involved, there are different priorities. And that's where not only do you see an antagonistic relationship between law enforcement and immigrants, you see an antagonistic relationship between state and federal. I'm sure you've heard of the term sanctuary city. It's one of these big buzzwords. It doesn't actually mean anything, right? Sanctuary city is a vague term. It's often used mostly by the enemies of the so-called sanctuary cities. And it's the idea that, they're just letting in anybody here, and they're letting them drain the resources and this and that and the other. Really, at the end of the day, what New York City's sanctuary policies involve is that they do not honor the detainer requests of the Department of Homeland Security. So that means that they are not trying to enforce federal civil immigration law for the federal government. And so the NYPD will not keep someone detained longer than they need to, according to their own internal state or city policies. And then the whole purpose of those laws, or at least the public-facing purpose of those laws, was to actually enable immigrants or people from immigrant communities to not feel unsafe when reporting crimes against them, or not to feel unsafe when having to go to court, or not to feel unsafe when having to be a witness in court. And so actually you see a strange situation where states will protect immigrants in a way, precisely so that they can be used in other law enforcement capacities. So it's not exactly a straightforward antagonistic relationship. In some ways they're trying to use their own federal/state antagonisms and then co-opt immigrants and their own individual interests to one side or the other. But it is a complicated situation. There's also a situation right now, and I haven't seen much of it, and it's new, but the Biden administration announced last year a special deferred action program for immigrants who are cooperating with the Department of Labor in reporting or witnessing to labor violations. And so deferred action is this idea that the Department of Homeland Security will deliberately choose not to enforce what they could otherwise enforce. And then that might include granting them temporary work authorization and just a sort of set duration in which they will not be deported, or action against them will not be taken, so that they can cooperate with the DOL and getting the employer who's alleged to have committed some labor violation. So these things are very convoluted and it's not very straightforward. But I think overall, just to answer the question very simply, it is an antagonistic relationship in general.
Yeah, that example you gave about migrants being used to testify in criminal cases or something like that seems kind of descriptive of the state's relationship to immigration as a whole, which is to say it's useful for them in certain cases, and they're willing to protect it so long as it's useful to them, and then as soon as they can dispense with the pleasantries once they no longer serve a purpose.
That's actually a very important part. Often whenever the federal government announces some program that appears to be helpful to immigrants, there's a skepticism and a correct and justified skepticism on the part of immigrants themselves or their advocates as to whether they should cooperate. In fact, this is the whole thing with the DACA, right? When the DACA program was first rolled out, the Department of Homeland Security was asking people to apply for DACA by basically submitting these very lengthy applications that included lots of information about themselves and their family members, and their work histories, their education histories, their address histories, all of these things that could be used against them later if the Department of Homeland Security wanted to use it against them. And so the question was, should they opt into this program in the odd chance that it would help them out, but that could be used against them in the future or used against their families in the future? And this was a long-running debate in the community, in the legal advocacy community, about whether or not we should get involved at all. And then a lot of people benefited from DACA, but as I'm sure many people know, the DACA program was suspended thanks to some judicial trickery that people should have foreseen. But it was complicated.
Yeah, any privileges, I guess, that seem given freely can just as quickly be taken away.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, changing topics a little bit, I wanted to bring things back to the reason why us as the Independent Labor Club are hosting this panel, which is to say, for those just learning about us, the Independent Labor Club was formed in response to the rapid decay of civil social organizations over the last half century or so, because these types of organizations, we believe, were the building blocks for creating a sustainable mass politics. So I wanted to kind of dive into the state of civil social organizing in the city and among immigrant communities in particular. If we take civil social organizations to mean groups of people with a similar, if not exact, relationship to capital, building structures of community support and socialization, what kinds of civil social organizing has emerged among immigrant communities in New York City? And maybe you can start off talking about your organization.
Yeah, for sure. And in the Mexican community, because that's where we started to organize, was predominantly with the Mexican community. In New York City, there are a few nonprofits that really kind of monopolize this advocacy for the Mexican community. One is called La Colmena, which is in Staten Island. There's one called Masa, which is in the South Bronx. There's one called Mixteca, which we would say is probably the strongest group out of these three. And they operate in Sunset Park. So, but unfortunately, a lot of times these NGO type organizations kind of handle single issue, single issues basically, and they don't necessarily connect all these issues together. For us, it was important to kind of try to connect all these issues because we knew that, like, okay, why are you street vending? It's to pay your rent. Why do you have to work 68 hours? It's because your rent is 40% of your income. But also, why is it 40% of your income? It's because your wage is so low and it hasn't gone up. Why do you struggle paying for basic necessities like eggs and milk? It's because your wage isn't going up. So all these things are connected, and we personally felt like civil organizations should tackle all these issues, not necessarily all at once, but connect them, so that people who are in these organizations kind of understand the scope of what the work that needs to be done is kind of enormous. Honestly, we are faced with an enormous task these days. Unfortunately, these organizations, they have power in the sense of like they're like legitimized by the state, basically. City council members have this discretionary funding that they get to fund local organizations, and oftentimes these organizations get that money. Mixteca, which I mentioned before, it was just given $2.5 million in capital funding to expand their programming, to buy the space so that they are a pillar in the community. Well, these are just funds that grassroots organizations don't touch, honestly. So for us, it's really a Herculean effort to try to match these organizations in the sense of like organizing the community. Because they do organize the community. They do have members. They do have a mass platform that they use and weaponize and mobilize, really. So for us, it's kind of like, how do we counter that soft power that they have with our own? But also in terms of like our civil organization, Plaza Proletaria, like we kind of, and it's not as grandiose, but we kind of like, take an example out of like the Soviets and like what they kind of like, this is just like a worker council. Basically, you all workers come together and you come and you discuss what issues, or what organizing needs to be done. That's kind of like the scope and how we picture the plaza is like, have all these workers, have all these folks come and discuss their problems. And going back to how we can connect all these problems that are arising, we see these problems intersect in the family level. A lot of times in these households, these families, like the child, their job prospects are not as bright as they were before. Nowadays you go to school and you get your bachelor's, and it is tough to get a job with your bachelor's these days. And even then, it's now things like CUNY that used to be free are no longer free, and who really suffers from that? The working class and the working class youth that no longer see that as a viable means of moving up. So that's one example for the families, especially working with immigrant families. Like, immigration intersects there in the family. It affects everybody, whether or not it's the parents who are at risk or it's the child who has DACA. These things intersect there, labor, housing. Another reason is that that we see the necessity to organize around all these issues is because you need to engage a wide audience, basically. It's tough, honestly. Even when we talk about women's issues, it can be kind of controversial within the family. Sometimes if they're in a marriage, sometimes the husband thinks that we're like trying to infect them with like anti like husbandry, like all these ideas that they think that we're trying to infect them with.
Radical feminism.
Yeah, exactly. So again, we struggle within these families, and these are sites of struggle, and then we bring them together and we piece it together. Yeah. So the family and civil society in general, just like how we organize people who also, again, not all immigrants have the right to vote, right? Like, it's not a monolith. what are alternatives to quote unquote civic engagement, where they tell you that your civic engagement is voting every now and then, but what do you tell people who can't vote? That you just don't engage and you're just not. So how do we engage them?
Yeah, it sounds like very difficult work and along the lines of I think what we're trying to do here at the ILC, but I feel like it follows kind of a traditional Marxist understanding of how class consciousness is built. Like you were saying, connecting these things, people who might participate in these more, politically minded organizations that have this particular political purpose are probably people who are already politically engaged and politically conscious, and not people who haven't gotten the opportunity to compare notes and be like, oh, you're getting exploited in the same way I am. That's interesting. Maybe there's some unity there. So
another thing that we learn is that people learn differently. As Marxists, our texts are kind of cumbersome sometimes, and they're like kind of hard to get through, and we don't expect to like give folks like that just like literature and here read it. So we try to show film. We do it through art. We do it through programming. We do it through workshops. One of the first texts that we use as a study with the Plaza is the pedagogy of the oppressed, just so that people can kind of go in understanding what we're trying to get at. That like, in order to really tackle oppression, you first need to unveil that for people so that people can see that they're oppressed. Because you go around telling people that they're oppressed, and they're gonna tell you you're bugging. They're gonna tell you that you don't know me, you don't know my life. So how can you tell me I'm oppressed? Yes, we understand that generally we're oppressed, but how do you really contextualize that for people?
yeah, being oppressed is kind of like it carries a connotation of shame too.
Exactly.
People don't want to admit to being oppressed. I feel like I see it, teaching at John Jay. You mentioned CUNY and what's everything that's going on there. You do see a lot of students who they are there because this is the traditional route to move out of the working class, but there's a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? I guess there's just kind of an adriftness because there's also this sense that this isn't a guarantee of future economic success, and I do have to pay for it still. So. It's interesting. All right, I have a question for Jordan. You can answer it first if it as well, Leo, if it speaks to you. But among the sort of civil social organizing space, or given the context of that, what is the connection you see between public and private resources that immigrant workers are excluded from due to their legal status? We've talked about that a little bit, but if you could expand on that. And the emergence of these orgs to fill in the gaps, or where do you think is the best place for civil social organizations to put their energy and resources given sort of the legal exclusions you might see?
I think I should preface my answer by saying that as a lawyer, I'm very limited in my knowledge of broader things than law.
Sure.
That said, in my work currently and in my previous work, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of different organizations and associations that help immigrants or represent immigrants and their interests in different ways. Now, my specific experience has to do with their legal side. And so one fundamental disconnect, I think, between lawyers and our clients is that we think about things differently. So when you ask me what I care about, I'm thinking about strategy, I'm thinking about legal analyses, I'm thinking about how best to gather and obtain evidence and to present evidence and so forth. When you ask my clients what they care about, they're caring about putting food on the table, or they're caring about not being inside an incarcerated situation. Or maybe they're thinking about what they need to do to keep their apartment or their house or their job. And so they have a much more, their concerns are more immediate day-to-day concerns. Mine are more heady, abstract, legal things. So that's all to say that my experience with civil society and with the different things that we touched upon is, I think, kind of rarefied in a way compared to most of our clients' actual real life concern, flesh and blood concerns.
Sure.
Mine's more paper, it's abstract, things like that. Now, it's true when you say immigrants are excluded from a lot of the public resources that are available to non-citizens, that are available to citizens. And so, absolutely, people will, in those kind of situations, will turn to informal or less formal community resources, support networks, and things like that. one thing that definitely does sort of tie all this together is the fact that a lot of immigrants do not have the time to get involved beyond in their community organizations beyond just what they need for their to put food on the table. And so
Because of demands of work,
right,
essentially.
exactly.
There.
And then just the demands of not of trying to not be in trouble and not be evicted, not be deported, not be arrested, and so forth. So that's one fundamental disconnect I think between the NGO side of things and the actual needs of the communities they are purported to serve. Now, those organizations where they do exist, I think, are filling in necessary gaps. But there's also limitations in what they can do, and this goes back to what you were saying a little bit earlier. NGOs have a mandate, right? NGOs are trying to fill in the requisite requirements for the IRS code, so they get tax exemptions. They're trying to make their shareholders happy, or rather they get deliverables for the donors and what have you. So they have specific mandates and specific institutional requirements that I think prevent things that are more holistic or politically minded or more broader.
Right.
So it's a much more narrow vision, I think, by design and even by definition.
Not to mention, I guess, the threat posed of doing meaningful political organizing when you have an uncertain legal status.
Yeah, I mean, and one very important thing is that some NGOs are explicitly precluded from helping people without legal status, right? It's including some immigration legal services as an example.
Because it might jeopardize their.
Well, because of federal law,
Right.
which in some cases prevents it. So it's there's a lot of different things that go into it, but overall, the narrowing of the visions of NGOs, I think, is built into it.
Yeah.
And so people have to turn to alternative resources.
So then, Leo, if you could expand on that a little, it sounds like Plaza Proletaria might be quite unique in that sense because most immigrants probably, again, they have so little time and energy at the end of the day that whatever civil social organizing does exist is to just meet basic needs. So was it difficult to try to stand something? It sounds, or talking earlier, it seems like you guys had such a huge response right away. What do you think was the difference there?
Well, I do want to touch on the
Yeah.
fact that the risk of struggle basically is apparent to some people, especially to the immigrant folks who have their families that depend on them, whether or not their families are here or their families are living abroad or back home. There's always this risk aversion to putting their family at risk essentially. We try to tackle that, but we also explain to them that we need their support, whether or not they're frontlining or not is not necessarily what we're asking them to do, because we also understand that they can't frontline. But we also understand that there are a lot of folks that would frontline for them. I think that's kind of something that they trying to get them to understand that, and they see it through action when they see people that they don't even know come and try to contribute around their needs. The other thing I'll mention, because we talk about NGOs, is we also try to talk to the NGO workers themselves, because we separate them from the organization. We say that because these days, being an NGO worker is kind of one of the only avenues to work sometimes, especially coming out of college. They want you. There's really not that many. It's either you work for the city or the state in a public way, or in a private way through the NGOs or through these corporations.
I know a lot of Marxist master's graduates who, what else are they going to do? if they're not that? Yeah.
Exactly though. But so we try to try to organize the NGO workers as well. We also see them as part of the working class, albeit obviously a little bit more of the intelligentsia. The second thing that we always study is the wretched of the earth. One of the things that we talk about is a colonized intellectual. A lot of times folks think they're doing good by upholding these norms and standards. But we try to radicalize them as well and agitate them into being more subversive. Not necessarily by putting their jobs at risk, but when you clock out, you can contribute more and you can do more. By helping people who aren't necessarily in these NGOs kind of understand their legal expertise or like the legal background. I will say also NGO workers, they do offer the organizations a big support. These are people who know how to organize. They have technical knowledge. One of the things that we lack sometimes in our organization is just putting things in an Excel. And these people are organized in that way. They know. They're on top. They have schedules. They make calendars. They follow up. They send the emails out. So all these things are important, and we need all these types of expertises in all these organizations.
We need people who live for paperwork. Anyone out there? God bless you. Okay, well, getting back to kind of the original premise of the panel, which is the reporting and statements from public officials surrounding not only the purported budget crisis, but the related issue of the growing number of homeless in the city. It seems we're meant to believe that there are significant trade-offs between the legacy homeless population, if that's what you want to call it, and the migrant homeless when it comes to things like conditions, wages, access to work in general, and public services. But according to recent estimates that I was looking at, as much as half or more of those living in New York City without permanent homes are immigrants and asylum seekers, which is a pretty astounding figure given the figure of total homeless is massive. So I wanted to ask, just to start us off, can you speak to New York City's right to shelter law and the recent shelter stay limits put in place by the Adams administration on migrants?
Yeah, the right to shelter laws go back all the way to the 1930s with the New York State Constitution. And back then there was a provision that said that the state would provide shelter to the unhoused. This didn't really become a major issue until the 80s when there was a New York State Supreme Court case called Callahan v. Carey. And it held that there was a right to shelter that the state, or rather the city of New York, was required to provide for the homeless male population. And that was later extended to the female population and the population generally. There's been some tinkering with that over the years, but basically that basic principle has withstood since the 80s, up until 2022, when the alleged surge of migrants came to New York City, and Officer Mayor Adams pronounced a indefinite state of emergency, or it was a temporary state of emergency that's been renewed every 5 days or so since 2022. And that led to this sort of political controversy in the city, where the city was claiming that there was not enough resources, not enough willpower, or political capital to house all of these migrants who were reportedly flooding the streets. And the mayor's office was threatening to jeopardize the entire right to shelter altogether. And so this is a sort of an artificial antagonism created by the city, pitting the migrants against the locals, saying that, okay, well, you leftists, you advocates, you activists want us to give beds to the migrants. If you keep pushing us, no one will get beds. Sort of thankfully, but not so thankfully, there was a settlement reached in a lawsuit handled by the Legal Aid Society and the mayor's office, where a compromise position was reached. Basically, the right to shelter was upheld in principle, but it was limited in practice, and specifically it created this very strange bifurcated or even trifurcated system of differentiating citizens from non-citizens from other types of non-citizens.
Like single men versus...
Yeah, also based on their marital status or their familial status or even their actual immigration status. So for instance, not everybody who's being deported or at risk of being deported is an asylum seeker, right? Asylum is a specific application you are applying for. Not everybody's doing it. And not everybody who's lumped together in this group called the migrants is applying for asylum. So the compromise that was reached basically said that certain people, certain asylum seekers who arrived at a certain time, I think the date was sometime in 2022 or something, those people will be given 30 days in a shelter that they can only renew if certain conditions are met. And then certain other people might get 60 days provided certain conditions are met. And then if they cannot meet those conditions, they are going to be evicted from the shelter or given a ticket out of the state. And so that was the choice given to these people. And so ultimately it created what a lot of people are calling a separate and unequal system of shelter in what is otherwise supposed to be a constitutional right for all New Yorkers, independent of their immigration status. I mean, this is a state provision, nothing to do with the federal civil designation. Immigration is a federal issue, nothing to do with state law. So the New York State Constitution has no distinction made between a citizen and a non-citizen when it comes to providing shelter. But the mayor basically forced the shelter system to accept this compromised position in which people were sorted out of these very strange, convoluted categories that I don't even understand myself. I mean, it's kind of new. I haven't really seen much of it personally, but I have some experience, looking at it and dealing with people affected by it, and it escapes my understanding. It's very strange.
Yeah, it seems like almost the way you're describing it, like a informal but de facto labor distribution network. Like where are most of these migrants who are taking bus tickets, presumably, or plane tickets out of the city? Where they go?
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Can you read the question?
You were talking about those who choose to, given the choice of eviction or a ticket out of the city. Is that what you were describing?
Yeah.
Where do most of them go to? Like it
I'm
seems.
not sure, actually.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah, just anywhere, I guess. Anywhere that they have family or.
If they have,
Yeah.
and that's one of the major issues. That's why they're unhoused to begin with.
Yeah.
is If they're coming here as asylum seekers, perhaps they only come with their known family.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have no one else around, or no one else who has the means or the resources or the legal status to put themselves at risk of housing somebody else.
Yeah.
So it's a hard decision. I have not seen it personally myself, so I can't speak to it, but it is a thing that exists. That
Yeah.
is the dilemma that people are put into.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to speak to on that?
Just briefly about just immigration in general. I mean, speaking from the Mexican experience, the Mexican community migrated largely to New York City, at least largely in the 90s and the early 2000s, late 80s. But back then we saw like kind of a phenomena of the men coming first, working, and then sending either for their families to come here or just remitting back home. I think today we see a larger trend of families coming. And I think that that's also why these politicians and American rhetoric in general has also soured towards the immigrants, because now they're coming with their families, and now they play this card of like they're burdening the American people. And that's also why they separate families more now. It's kind of almost of a deterrence to the families coming. It's like, don't come here, we will separate you.
If you're here to live rather than work, then
Exactly.
we got news for you. It's not
Exactly.
gonna
And
happen.
then going back to the homelessness and that crisis itself is like, that crisis is going to be exacerbated because we're going to start seeing more homeless families on the street. Not necessarily homeless individuals. We're going to start seeing homeless families on the street. So these things are affecting, again, but even the Mexican migration here is affected by foreign policy, and as well as all the other migration patterns that come here.
Yeah, and there is obviously, I feel like, some limitations in talking about this in context of city politicians, city officials, because obviously the problem of this scale and size can really only be tackled by if the federal government were determined to, and obviously they're not for a million reasons which we all know. But speaking to, I guess, kind of this, as independent agents, an activist, an organizer, a lawyer, a teacher, we can only narrowly address these problems so much. But I imagine most of us here, do have ambitions towards something larger, towards the emancipation of the international working class, rather than just the rights of workers, legal or otherwise. But what kind of trade-offs do you see? I think it's obviously there's a lot of a narrative build-up of opposition or an antagonistic relationship between the traditional working class of the city, quote unquote, and the immigrant working class of the city. And I think a lot of that is obviously overblown, and it's done for very particular reasons. But I think there are some legitimate trade-offs. So between the wages and rights of those workers, or at least that's the position they're put in. So given those trade-offs, like what are those for one, or what do you see as those, and how do we, rather than shy away from those, how do we attempt to tackle those and overcome those, given the maybe different interests between those two groups?
in terms of trade-offs, I would say, well, it's honestly for us with the both like the immigrant working class and the working class, the American working class. Well, we kind of, for us, it's about showing them that both Republicans and Democrats aren't for your interest, honestly, and things don't change regardless of who's in power. And then we go back to the question of fascism. I mean, well, the Trump's movement shows that fascism is going to stay in the political wheel, like the spectrum, going forward. But it also shows us that the Democrats are willing to conciliate with this fascist trend, and not only conciliate with that trend, they're willing to integrate it into their programming because, well, unfortunately, look, fascism gets thousands of votes, hundreds of thousands of votes, if not millions of votes. Not just here in the US, but also throughout the world. Fascism is on the rise. And I might be straying away a little bit, but this goes back to like how they also use the quote-unquote failures of social democracy to really kind of stroke this frustration amongst the working class. It doesn't just happen here. I mean, here it happens a lot. You know, they try to like, it goes back to, I don't know, I know you guys probably saw the Daily News post, the cover with Kamala Harris with this hammer and sickles and like Trump, they're like trying to make this rhetoric that Kamala is communist, and it's like this way of like telling the American people like, don't go with the leftists. And Kamala, on the other hand, is like obviously not a leftist, and obviously more of the center right of the political spectrum in the U.S. But for us, going back to the question is like, for us, this offers us a moment to like really try to conciliate both what are deemed as opposing interests from this working class. At the end of the day, it goes back to both classes don't want to be exploited. And the American working class kind of understands that inherently, that the bosses prefer a labor force that is more vulnerable to exploitation. And they kind of understand this without being able to put it and articulate it themselves. But that's why they've turned into this like, they also buy into the demagogy that both parties use to villainize the new wave of migrants, at least.
Well, I mean, I think your point about fascism is really salient because, you know, I think by and large, the American working class, if you want to call it native or traditional or whatever, you know, they are alienated from the political system and both parties. But that has, I think, as we've seen, trended more towards a more fascist response to these problems rather than a more liberatory, justice-based response to those problems. So it's a difficult question, but I think it's, do you have anything to add on to that, Jordan?
Yeah, I was talking before this event started over there by the snack table about Karl Marx and Angela Nagel. Angela Nagel had this fantastic and ridiculous essay a few years ago where she argued, what was it called, the left case against open borders. And she quoted Marx, this is what I remember, she quoted Marx talking about the antagonism between the English working class and the Irish working class. And she used this to show that, look, people of different nationalities, you know, cannot get along and, you know, they drive down wages, blah, blah, blah. Forgetting to include the very next paragraph where he talks about this antagonism being artificial and being, quote, the secret of the impotence of the working class, or the secret of the power of the English ruling class. Mm-hmm. So that antagonism is artificial. This is very true when it comes to the modern situation in the United States. There's a very strong artificiality to that purported antagonism. I'll give you an example. There's the claim that immigrants drive down wages, right? And so the idea is that they're willing to work for lower wages, and in the process, therefore, they're driving everyone's wages down. Well, the question is, why are they working for lower wages? Why are they able to, as an example, or theoretically, work under the table for wages that are lower than minimum wage? Well, it's because they're in the informal economy. If they're being paid under the table, If they're being paid off the books, well then there you go. The question is, why are they off the books? Because they don't have work authorization. It's precisely the regime that's meant to exclude the immigrants that's making it possible and incentivizing them to work under the table and requiring them to do so. So, here's a very simple solution, right? If you complain about immigrants not paying taxes and not, or driving down the wages, well, here's a very simple solution. Give them work authorization. They'll pay taxes and they'll be part of the regular workforce like everybody else. So here's just a very simple example of the way in which it's precisely the system meant to exclude the immigrant that's perpetuating the argument to exclude them to begin with. And so I don't actually see myself, personally, I don't see a real antagonism. Of course, there are trade-offs here and there. When you're talking with the system as it exists, of course, it's indisputable that workers are in competition with each other. That's regardless of their immigration status. Everybody's in competition with everybody else, unless they're not, right? And they only become not in competition with each other when they are in solidarity with each other. And so I think the broader question should be, what are the things that are preventing solidarity or that are incentivizing the lack of solidarity between, different classes or different, basically like legal, artificially constructed legal categories. At the end of the day, this is a legal category. Right? It's only by an operation of law that somebody matters as an immigrant, right? It's the law that says you are a citizen or not a citizen and what type of non-citizen you might be. So if you wanted to end the immigration problem, tomorrow, you could just make them not immigrants. Right? That's a law. That's a very simple way to do it.
Right. Yeah. It's clear the utility of that sort of bifurcated labor system. The Chinese state wasn't stupid when they started their internal passport. They had to fabricate it out of whole cloth, whereas we already have these artificial fabrications like the southern border. But that to say, I feel like that's a good lead into the last question I have for you guys, and then we can open it up to some Q&A if people have questions. Which is, given all of that we've talked about, what are the steps we need to take to try and break down that artifice? Because we're kind of in this difficult position of it. It sounds like the case you're making is like it's very difficult to have working class solidarity between these groups so long as this illegal status remains and absence of work authorizations and all these other types of things. That's almost a unbreakable. The white or native working class of the city is always going to have that maybe antagonism unless that comes first, but hard to get people to advocate for that without that. So all that to say, what do you think we need to do to break down this artifice and to build solidarity between civil society among immigration or among immigrants and among other workers?
Yeah, it's an enormous task, honestly. Like, there's so many facets to the struggle. But I think, saying it generally, like, we need to combat this hegemony, this bourgeois hegemony that they've, given us, that they've imposed on us. And how do we do that? By, building grassroots organizations like the Independent Labor Club, like Plaza, making our own media, basically, helping distribute newspapers and podcasts and these new ways that people are learning. TikTok is a big, honestly, like, TikTok is working. Like, we have a TikTok and it gets a lot of views and people, well, unfortunately today people's attention span is very condensed into like 30 seconds to a minute. So you really have to be good at agitation to really get through. So again, it's building media, it's also building independent organizations, but at the end of the day, it is a struggle for political liberties and for political power. We do see that as a necessity. Like, we need political power. That's why in the beginning we mentioned that, like, we do see the need to build a genuine working class party, and it's not to throw shade at any party that is already out there, but and if there is a genuine party out there, then we want to build it up. And we want to, like, help it grow, but we just don't see that right now. And we say that we need, like, a genuine working class party because this working class party has to be able to agitate, again, the immigrants, the American workers, the people in informal economy, all workers and their allies. The college students, the petit bourgeois, and helping kind of lead the way for also even the lumpen proletariat class. Honestly, we've had our trouble with the lumpen proletariat class in the sense of like they're a little bit too fickle, in the sense like they are only here, well, I forgot which author writes that, like they're more likely to be bought out. It kind of happened to us when we were struggling against we had a struggle in 2023 against the city councilwoman Alexa Aviles, who's a DSA representative, by the way, and they like kind of threw us under the bus when it came down to like negotiating for permits. And she was able to convince a lot of the folks who had like a lumpen background to go with her, basically, and to like buy into her rhetoric of giving permits. No permits have been given in Sunset Park. But again, all right, so just it goes back to if there was nothing else there, we need a genuine political party to really advance the interest of all workers and to really be able to make these contradictions between, or perceived contradictions or perceived antagonisms between the immigrant working class and the American working class, and to really kind of build that force going forward.
Yeah. I want to hear from Jordan on this too, but to briefly interject, and to make the case again for the necessity of civil society organizations, the first working class parties, at least, it's kind of our analysis, emerge out of those, and with the recession of public services that they're threatening constantly and enacting, somebody has to fill in those gaps and build a parallel structure. So I'll just say I agree, not to be too concordant, but go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I wish I answered first, because that's a more hopeful and concrete answer than I would have given, and I'm about to give right now. I don't really have any answers to that kind of question. I'll echo what you both seem to agree on. Sounds good to me. As for what I can offer here is, I think that the first step before, organizing a workers' party, doing a radical revolution, which is, of course, we all agree is necessary, is understanding where exactly we are in the present moment. And that is, of course, a very vague statement to make. I'm going to bring it a little bit more concrete here. I think that it's important to know that when we're dealing with the subject of immigrant labor and what the problems are with it or for it, so on, is understanding what role it plays in the sort of totality of U.S. history, the U.S. economy, and the U.S. political structure. Right? We're talking about the fundamental division, legal division in the United States, which is the citizen and the non-citizen divide. This is something that is way broader than just the narrow question of people moving to the United States recently, or seeking asylum recently, or even historically. It goes back to the Civil War. What happened in the Civil War? There was a large labor question, the question of enslaved labor. And there's the question of what to do with them when they were no longer enslaved. The solution offered was to give them all citizenship. This is what created the 14th Amendment, the Reconstruction Amendments, universal birthright citizenship. This was supposed to be a solution to the problem, but it created a new problem. When you say that everybody who's born on U.S. soil is a citizen, the question becomes who is not born on U.S. soil and who is not a citizen. And so it's only immediately after the Reconstruction period, and maybe even a little bit during the Reconstruction period, that the modern federal immigration legal system is created with the very first federal immigration law, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that was a law passed in 1880-something, right, just a couple decades after the war, which was about the specific question of how do we exclude more people who could theoretically claim citizenship that we had just given to all the emancipated freedmen. There was this liberatory moment when everybody became a U.S. citizen and you all have the privileges and immunities of the United States citizens. Now we need to create a new system of people who could not benefit from those privileges and immunities. And the first category that was applied to were Chinese and Asian generally, what they called coolies, right? People who were accused, or maybe correctly, but they were basically said to be in slavery-like conditions. And so the same story repeated, right? And the same story repeats to this day. You have anti-immigrant advocates saying, look, we got to keep out these people because look, they're so poor, they're being trafficked, and we have to save them from themselves. We have to keep them out so that they don't get exploited. And then you have a sort of, Venn diagram there, because on the other side, people don't want the workers to be exploited. And then this comes to a head when people say, okay, well, we'll stop exploitation by keeping them out altogether. That result is the result, I think, of the unresolved contradiction of creating citizenship and a non-citizenship divide, where privileges and immunities and rights and so forth are contingent upon the arbitrary distinction of citizen and non-citizen. Of course, you speak to any American today and you ask them, okay, well, what do you think about citizenship? If you propose the idea of abolishing citizenship, right? I think that people would laugh in your face. That is something that is an immense hurdle. The last time this problem really came up, as I said, was in the Civil War, and it took a civil war to handle it. Now, I hope it doesn't get to that, but maybe it will.
Well, you said it's not a very hopeful answer, but you got me excited. No, I mean, I do think that despite the painfulness of that story and how difficult of a long march it's been, it also details out how these radical transformations of the definition of a citizen and the rights of citizenship have changed. Sometimes through legal and sometimes through violent or extra economic means. So hopefully, I think it's and all that despite pervasive bigotry, racism, xenophobia, it has been with us that whole long while. So, anyways, that to say, thank you so much to our panelists. That was great, and I wanted to open it up for a Q&A. If anybody has any questions, you guys are able to take some. Question? Sure. You want to use the mic or?
Thanks so much for being here. I'm glad that you guys were able to make it. This question is for Leo. I was wondering, this is sort of a two-part question, but if you could tell us more about what happened in 2023 and the kind of police repression that y'all faced, and sort of extending from that, I'm wondering where the organizing work kind of began. You referenced Soviets, but a sort of exciting part of the Plaza movement was and is sort of reclaiming public space, reclaiming the neighborhood for the people who live there. And I was wondering if you could kind of explain that ethos and where that kind of civil social function starts from.
Yeah, for sure. I'll try to keep it brief. I mean, in 2020, we, the organizers of Plaza, were very active in the George Floyd movement, but a lot of the protests were happening in the city, and we would go out there and we would protest and we would take bridges and we would do all these things, but then we would take the ride home and we'd be like, damn, but nothing has changed. And we go back to we went back to our neighborhood, Sunset Park, and we would see things are still messed up. So we wanted to try to organize something there. In Latin America, the concept of plazas or public space is a lot more widespread. Here in the United States, we don't really, or at least in New York City, I mean, we don't really have this concept of public space. The sidewalk is as far as public space goes, and the parks, and Grand Army Plaza and all these other things. So we really wanted to go to the park and try to organize there. So for 2021, 2022, we were organizing an outdoor unpermitted market. It got huge. The last year we started with 9 vendors in 2021. At the end of 2021, we had 25. At the end of 2023, we had 81. So things were growing exponentially. They were kind of getting out of our hands, honestly, because we had no permits. So we wouldn't say no to anybody anyways, but we had no permits. So anybody who wanted to vend, we would show them how we were doing it. We were a very rambunctious group in the sense of we were exercising a lot of aggressiveness towards the parks police specifically, because here in New York City, the way it works is that in the parks, it's the parks police that has jurisdiction. So the parks police has to be the first one to come tell you no, or to put things away. And after that, if they can't handle it, they call the NYPD. Typically, that's how it goes. It's not always how it happens. Sometimes NYPD is just patrolling the parks and they take initiative. But from what we understood, that was how that went, especially with street vending. The parks police is not like a big force necessarily. So when they would come to the park, it'd be like 3 of them, and it'd be like tons of us. Like it'd be like 50 people, 60 people, and we would rally them. And we had a rule. We had like a thing where like if Jordan is vending, and I'm here vending next to Jordan, and the police come and they tell Jordan to put his stuff away, I have the obligation to put things down and come support Jordan. So everybody would rally, and we would do this thing where we would surround them. We would put them in a circle, and we would just start chanting and start like kind of really fighting back and like showing them that like, yo, we might do it today. That was kind of how that's kind of how it would happen. At the end of 2023, at the end of 2022, they were starting to take these like actions towards us. Like they would close the bathroom early. They would close it at like 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Sunday in the summer. And it wasn't just affecting us, it was affecting everybody that went to the park. So again, we had this ability to really galvanize people. And like, again, the thing with closing the parks bathroom early, or the fact that there are no public bathrooms, is that this affects predominantly women and children and elderly folk. The men, you know, for most parts, they like go across the street between cars, honestly. So it wasn't necessarily affecting them as much. But the women and children and the elderly were being affected. There was one moment in the end of 2022 where something happened. I threw a plate of food at a parks officer. It was embarrassing for me because it was a lack of discipline, honestly, and it goes back to show that like sometimes we as individuals need to maintain discipline, even though our feelings may be otherwise. Because I did this, they arrested me the next day, but it was the end of Plaza. But when we came back the next year in 2023, they did not allow us to set up. We were supposed to set up on April 2nd, 2023. When we got there, we were met by NYPD, by Parks Police, by the Parks administration. The city councilwoman came, the assemblywoman came. It was like a whole thing. They were already waiting for us in the park, and they told us that we weren't going to be allowed to set up this year. So that's kind of how that. They didn't let us set up, and then we started to do mutual aid in the sense because we had people make food. So we were like, we're not gonna send you home with food that's just gonna go to waste. Let's just distribute it free here. They had a problem with that as well. And then they started to enforce what's called the unlawful assembly. So in the park, you need a permit to be with more than 19 people. You need a permit. And they started to enforce this on us. And eventually they did start to threaten our organizers. And they said that if you keep doing this, we are gonna keep arresting you. And because of that, and because of the fact that we had a lot of immigrant folks who didn't really want to risk themselves, or we didn't want to put them at risk either, and we felt like we couldn't win that battle in that moment, so we just retreated. We found other spaces, and we tried to continue the vending. But the thing with the plaza was that we initially were trying to help people immediately right then and there with some money. The problem was that we were recreating capitalism, and we were recreating this small-scale producer mindset and this competition amongst vendors, especially when we got moved to a private place because the land relation changed. Before, when we were in the park, it was public, it was free, we had no permits, so we never charged nobody.
Not competition over space.
Exactly.
I imagine, too.
Yeah, that we were able to ameliorate between like in the assemblies. We were able to discuss like how that was going to happen. But then we moved to a private space, and in the private space, we did have to start like cooperating. Like, okay, like we do need donations from everybody in order to pay for the space. But once people gave donations, they felt entitled to a certain space or a certain lot, essentially. So. Our ethos at first was, let's go back to the neighborhood and try to make something work and try to like organize in the neighborhood. But then we also saw how something that was kind of at first may have been revolutionary did turn reactionary in that sense of like really kind of like distorting the real problem for people. It wasn't necessarily that you couldn't vend, it was you're so exploited that your housing costs are so high and you can't find a job and your prospects are dim, are not as bright. So again, that's kind of how that plaza started. What was the second part of the question?
You said it sort of was inspired by the Soviets and
Yes.
reclaiming public space. And I was wondering, like, you know, from the very beginning, like, how did that start? Like, who were your first vendors?
Yeah. Okay. Look, our first vendors were family members. They were people that we knew in the community already that were already vending. So we just asked them to come, and those were the first 9 vendors. But upon people in the community walking through the park and seeing 9 vendors, gradually people would gravitate towards us and ask, how can we be involved? And then gradually it started to accumulate. Back to the Soviet Park, because we were in Sunset Park, and if you come to Sunset Park, you'll know that park itself is literally like the pillar of the park. Like, everybody goes to Sunset Park because there is no other space to breathe fresh air and to walk in the park and to like see the sunset. So people were coming to the park regardless of the plaza or not. But what I mentioned to a comrade earlier was that the plaza had such a wide audience. We were getting people coming from Pennsylvania, from New Jersey, from Delaware. People from the West Coast would come, and they would come and visit us and be like, yo, we knew we had to come here. We wanted to talk to you. We wanted to see what this is. But because, and not to say like the rest of the 5 boroughs, so a lot of people were coming, and we were putting assemblies on. And these assemblies, everybody could participate, whether you were just walking through the park, whether you were a vendor, whether you were like family of the vendor, you could participate in these assemblies. And in these assemblies, we were talking about general issues, whether it was labor, whether it was healthcare, whether it was like housing, these things. One of the most important assemblies that we ever had was after the shooting that happened on 36th Street. After the shooting that happened on 36th Street, we called for an assembly, and it was big. It was like a lot of people came, and we were able to talk and really like kind of like make things clear for people. Like, look, there's a lot of problems, and the fact that the NYPD could not catch this man after shooting up this train station, but they're able to catch fare evaders right away was a contradiction for people to understand. Like, why couldn't they? It's because that wasn't necessary. That's not their like. They didn't care necessarily.
It's not their priority.
That's not their priority. So again, we mentioned Soviets, and I mentioned before, like, I'm not trying to get too grandiose, like we're not a Soviet, but we kind of like understood that in these councils, if we allow people to express themselves, more and more of their demands would be known. And that's a difficult part for people, is they have trouble expressing themselves. Our organization, that's another thing, like a qualitative change that we saw amongst the people we were organizing, was that they were gradually starting to communicate more, starting to express themselves more. Like at first, we would have assemblies and we would like kind of pass around the mic, and some people would speak very softly like this. And then towards the end of it, like today, if you come to one of our meetings, these same people are thundering, and they're like letting you know what they're saying. They want you to hear them. But at first, they would talk very low and like not really like trying to communicate. So again, these are some of the things that we kind of like gradually were able to unlock from the people, were their demands. What are your demands specifically? Because we can come into these neighborhoods and be like, yo, you need better housing. And that's because we know that generally, but what are your demands actually? We realized an example is that in Sunset Park, there's a lot of three family units. And unfortunately, the landlord lives in like the first unit. So it was difficult for some of these tenants to organize, because your landlord is in the first unit and their family members in the second unit, and you're in the third. And so it's difficult. You can't organize these tenants. They're literally the landlord. So these things were becoming clear to us, whereas before we did not know these things, and we were kind of naive about the real conditions in the neighborhood. We had an idea, but you don't really know the full scope until the people themselves tell you what are their problems actually.
Yeah, I mean, it does just getting back to that idea of, comparing notes and having someone either, just say, oh yeah, I also feel that way, or having someone articulate something that maybe you felt but you hadn't put words to is the start of all of this, I think. Any other questions for our panelists? Z?
Brief one. As I'm going through this. This will be for both of you, I think, whatever insights you have. We mentioned Kamala's position, this supposed AI-generated communist that's going to be, ruling all of us. Somewhat like famously, there was the speech she gave in was it Guatemala or Honduras, where she said, "Do not come."
Not coming.
Yeah. This marks a really stark change in the way in which the bourgeois parties in the U.S. have engaged with the question of immigration. Right. George W. Bush famously tried to reorient the Republican Party in a more immigration-friendly posture. The Democrats, at least, have historically positioned themselves as the friends of the immigrants, and we're seeing that thrown aside dramatically recently. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that are involved in that, and I'm curious if you have any insight into the degree to which climate change is impacting this. The extent to which the bourgeois parties have clamped down on this suggests, to some people, that there is a growing awareness that climate refugees are going to be a major strain on the economic capacities of this country to prevent disruption from just increasingly harsh conditions. And so I'm just curious what your understandings of that from people that you've spoken with and that you've interacted with. Like, is that becoming apparent now, or do you see that becoming more of a problem, and what your sense of that is?
For sure. I mean, from the reports that we get back from Mexico is that a lot of the rivers are drying up. If they're not dried up, the water bottling companies like Bonafont, which is a French enterprise corporation, they've been polluting the waters. A lot of my mother lives in Mexico now, and she's told us that that there's just droughts. Like, people don't know whether or not they can really rely on the land, not only for food, but not only for commerce and to exchange, but also for themselves, for food. But I will add to the climate change. I will say that even understanding how the drug problem in Mexico, in Central America, in South America, how these, the drug violence, the violence fueled by the drugs, and really how that's fueled by American appetite for drugs, and how these things really need to be kind of taken into consideration together. I will say that these are things that that's mass displacement, honestly, thousands and thousands of people. But yeah, in terms of climate change, I do think that these issues, they're coming to our border, and they're coming to our country, rightfully so. I mean, this country is one of the the biggest pollutants, the military-industrial complex. That's why we always say that if we really want to change things, we actually really need this power to stop that, to stop the military-industrial complex, stop the bourgeoisie from their carbon emissions, but also stopping the drug problem itself would really benefit migration and the refugees that are coming from these countries due to the and again, I mean, the Mexico the violence caused by the drugs. I mean, when we look at the American weapons that are used over there, it's all American weapons. It's all coming across the border. But we always tell the folks, the immigrants, to not watch people's mouths, to watch their hands, because Obama is somebody that we come to know as a chief deporter, because the deporter in chief, because he deported more people than any of the past presidents, even more so than Trump. So these are back to the climate change. I mean, these are things that we need action sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I'll add to that it's definitely something that is looming on the horizon. And we're already seeing the effects of it. I mean, not just from the southern border. I mean, the whole world right now is in shit, and it's gonna get into more shit as time goes on. I think that as for the question about is there a connection between that and, let's say, a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment? I don't know if it's a direct causation or even a correlation. Well, no, I'll take it back. I don't know if there's a direct causation. There's definitely a correlation. In two ways. One, that the more climate change there is, the greater incentive for what they call push factors, right? People moving out of their country of origin. Those will escalate. And then, two, the more that happens, there will be a greater backlash to immigrants the more they come. I wrote an essay about this a few years ago, and you can find it on my website, fine internet browser near you. It's about how it's very conspicuous that at the moment when the public is gaining more and more consciousness about the risk of climate change, and there seems to be a growing consensus, well, it already was, but a growing awareness of the consensus about it. At precisely that moment, the only thing the United States government seems to be doing about it or related to it is building up the border wall and building up the regimes of deportation and exclusion that will inevitably be used against people coming for safety in the coming decades. And so I don't know if that's a conscious move, but it certainly is an unconscious move. And it's something that I think we'll see the fruits of sooner rather than later, and when we need it the least.
Yeah, just whether it's fossil fuel consumption or the appetite for drugs in the United States, I mean, both of those are obviously huge threats to the stability of the country, but also kind of like load-bearing pillars of the political economy. You know, like these days, it seems like the opiate of the masses is just opiates. So it's a difficult thing because it is what, you know, for a sort of soulless, alienated society we've created here, it's what a lot of people have come to lean on, and it's makes it difficult to try to really address the root of the issue. But anyways, that to say, I feel like that's about all the time we have. And thank you so much to our panelists. They were wonderful, and thank you all for coming. I'm sure they're happy to field any questions over pizza in the next little bit. So feel free to stay for a bit, have some drinks, have some food, and thank you so much for coming. Want to say, if you haven't signed up and you're new, you want to put your contact information down, please do so over there. We also have some collection boxes for Woodbine, who's given us the space to use, and some donations for the ILC. So thank you so much, and hope to see you guys again soon.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. Thank you. That's great.
Oh yeah.